In the winter of 1875, a physician named Dr. Jonathan Kellard walked into his Massachusetts infirmary, carrying a belief no other man of science would dare touch, that the soul might not be spirit at all, but substance. He was no mystic, no preacher, no spiritualist. He was a man of measurements, of numbers and instruments. His notebooks were filled with pulse rates, breath counts, and the fading lines of human decline. Yet one entry would change the course of his life and haunt medicine for the next century. On the night of January 17th, Kellard prepared an experiment that bordered on blasphemy. A patient, Mary Elkins, terminally ill and unconscious, was placed on a finely balanced scale, a contraption he had built to register the slightest shift in weight. He noted every breath, every drop of sweat, every heartbeat growing quieter until finally, silence. Then the needle moved. Downward. Exactly 21 grams. No air escaped, no fluid was lost, no physical explanation could be found. His instruments had recorded what he called the departure of something unseen but measurable. He documented it meticulously, the time, the weight, the stillness. But what began as an experiment in physiology became a question that would divide science and faith for generations. Was this proof that human life left behind more than decay, that consciousness or soul possessed real mass? Or had Kellard, in his obsession with quantifying death, mistaken grief for data? For nearly 150 years, no one has been able to replicate his finding, and yet his original scale still rests in the basement archives of Merritt Hospital, locked and uncalibrated. A silent witness to one impossible measurement. Because if a soul truly weighs something, it means death itself leaves a trace we can measure. In the years following the American Civil War, the country existed in two worlds at once. One rooted in science, and another still haunted by the dead. The 1870s became an age of spiritualism, seances in parlors, mediums in morning gowns, in promises that the departed could still speak through candlelight and trembling tables. Yet alongside this hunger for faith came the birth of a colder pursuit, scientific rationalism, a belief that everything, even death, could be measured. It was into this divided world that Dr. Jonathan Kellard emerged, a man straddling both sides of the 19th century mind. A physician by training, Kellard had graduated from Cambridge Medical College with honours in anatomy and experimental physiology. He was respected, methodical, and entirely skeptical of superstition. But in 1873, cholera swept through Massachusetts and took his wife, Eliza, in less than a week. Witnesses recalled how, even as she lay dying, Kellard continued to chart her pulse and respiration, refusing to look away, as though calculation could anchor her life to the earth. Her death did not drive him to religion. It drove him to precision. He became obsessed with a single question. When life departs, what changes? The late Victorian laboratory was a crude theatre of experimentation, glass tubing, mercury thermometers, gas lamps flickering beside heavy brass scales. Science had only just begun to imagine that heat, energy, and even thought could be quantified. European materialists from Helmholtz to Bastian argued that consciousness was nothing but chemistry in motion. But Kellard disagreed. To him, the soul was not illusion, nor symbol. It was a form of mass, invisible, but real. He believed that, if the human spirit left the body, its exit would leave behind a measurable void. In 1874, Kellard published a brief letter in the Boston Medical Register, addressed to those who mistake mystery for impossibility. It read, "If the soul departs, it must displace something, light, heat, or weight. Let us weigh it." The letter drew ridicule from his peers, who called the idea morbid and unscientific. Yet quietly, Kellard began assembling an apparatus of his own design, a sealed chamber, a brass balance capable of detecting shifts smaller than a grain, if Zolt, and a promise to himself that he would find the truth between life and absence. By winter of 1875, the plan was ready. All that remained was a subject near death, and the courage to measure what could not be seen. The first documented trial took place on March 2, 1875, in a small ward of the Lowell Infirmary, Massachusetts. The subject was a 38-year-old woman named Eliza Brown, a seamstress in the late stages of tuberculosis. Her breathing was shallow, her pulse thread-like. Dr. Kellard obtained consent from the local parish and from Brown herself, who, according to hospital notes, agreed, saying she wished that her end might be of use. The experiment was clinical, not theatrical. A brass balance scale was built into the frame of a narrow wooden bed, sealed beneath a glass dome to prevent the interference of air or temperature. The scale could detect a difference of a single tenth of a gram. Around her stood 4 witnesses, a nurse named Mary Coyle, Reverend Jonathan Pike, and 2 medical students from Boston, Samuel Harris and William Dray. The candlelight trembled against the glass as the doctor began his observations. At 9:17 p. Eliza Brown exhaled her final breath. At 9:20, the balance shifted. The recorded loss was 21.2 grams. No fluid leakage, no deflation of the lungs, no air bubbles escaping the chamber. Kellard checked the seals himself. The Reverend prayed quietly while the doctor stared at the dial, unmoving. He noted in his log, "Observed reduction in mass concurrent with expiration. No external variable, no visible cause. The body remains still. Only the scale changes." Moments earlier, he had also seen the flame beside the apparatus flicker. Not from draft, but with a brief dimming, as if the room itself inhaled. He dismissed it as coincidence. News of the test spread through the hospital. Some called it proof of something sacred. Others whispered that it was blasphemy. Kellard remained cautious. "Once is not proof," he told his students. "Once is noise." Over the next 8 months, he repeated the trial 6 more times, each under stricter controls. Subjects varied. Patients in terminal decline from pneumonia, cancer, and heart failure. None showed the same dramatic change. Some lost nothing measurable at all. Others fluctuated erratically before returning to equilibrium. Kellard revised his entire method. He recalibrated for temperature, humidity, and gas exchange, even accounting for microscopic evaporation from the skin. The balance was placed under vacuum pressure to eliminate drafts. But as he removed potential errors, one pattern persisted. A faint, upward tremor in the scale just before death, as though something lighter than air stirred within the chamber. In his personal journal, found decades later in a sealed drawer of his Cambridge home, one passage stands out in faded ink. "I thought weight only falls." Yet in their final seconds, the dying rise, if only by a breath. "It is not loss I am measuring. It is departure." To his colleagues, he claimed detachment. To himself, he admitted wonder and fear. The loss of his wife 2 years prior still lingered behind his logic, and each subject reminded him of her stillness, the moment her warmth became air. By the autumn of 1875, Kellard had gathered enough data to convince himself that he was measuring something real, but not yet enough to explain it. Every test led him closer and further away. What if it was not matter at all, but energy? Not death measured in grams, but life transforming beyond the reach of instruments. He would not say it aloud, but those who knew him saw the change. The man who once believed in numbers had begun to chase the invisible. And in that pursuit, the line between science and desperation had quietly disappeared. In the winter of 1972, a junior archivist named Ellen Crane was tasked with cleaning out the storage vault of the long-abandoned Massachusetts State Asylum. The building was being prepared for demolition, and what remained inside were the forgotten detritus of a century. Ledgers, glass slides, and boxes marked only by fading ink. In one corner, buried beneath stacks of patient admission forms and weathered casebooks, she found a series of iron-bound journals sealed in wax. On the first cover, carved faintly with a scalpel, were the initials H.K., Dr. Henry Kellard. Inside, she found not madness, but meticulous order, sketches of apparatuses, hand-calculated tables, and long sequences of trial notes written in the measured hand of a scientist. What caught her attention were the repeated titles: Soul Balance Apparatus, Thermal Displacement Series, and Experiments on Departure, 1875. When she brought the journals to the light, the pages gave off a faint metallic sheen. Later analysis confirmed traces of mercury vapor, used by Kellard to stabilize temperature and pressure in his sealed chamber. The soul balance apparatus, as detailed in Kellard's designs, was far from crude. It was an iron-framed enclosure, supporting the dying subject, surrounded by barometric sensors and a precision balance capable of detecting fluctuations smaller than 1/10 of a gram. Within the chamber, air currents were eliminated. Temperature kept constant. The patient's pulse was measured alongside an early form of electrical response, Kellard's attempt to capture not only the moment of death, but the transition itself. In one of his sketches, a small note appears beside the scale diagram. If the soul departs, it must displace something. Find that motion. For decades, the journals were dismissed as curiosities, relics of Victorian obsession. But in 1998, physicist Dr. Henry Duval of the Massachusetts Institute of Technology re-examined the materials. Using digital reconstruction of Kellard's recorded figures, Duval found a startling correlation. The tiny fluctuations Kellard recorded, movements no larger than a fraction of a gram, matched what modern physics now calls quantum thermal decay, a microscopic release of energy that occurs when cellular systems lose their last cohesive order. In Kellard's own century, such precision would have been impossible by accident. This man, Duval said in an interview, was measuring at a level we wouldn't define for another 100 years. Whether he was measuring a soul or entropy, he was measuring the frontier between life and matter. Among the journals, Ellen Crane discovered a smaller leather-bound book. Its pages brittle, almost translucent. Between the data charts, Kellard had pressed dried leaves, thin and veined, like small relics of another world. Interleaved with them were fragments from a Bible, torn and annotated. On one fragment, from the Book of Job, he had underlined a single word: wait. In the margin beside it, in fading graphite, he wrote, "She felt lighter before she was gone." Historians would later debate whether "she" referred to Eliza Brown, his tuberculosis patient, or to his late wife, the woman whose death had first sent him down this path. Further into the notebook, Kellard's tone shifted. The careful precision gave way to philosophical unease. One entry reads, "If matter gives birth to spirit, then death is a release of force. If spirit gives birth to matter, then every life is a condensation of thought. In either case, something leaves." Crane's discovery went beyond paper. Alongside the journals were glass photographic plates labeled with faint notations like Trial 4, March 3, 1875, and Post-Mortem Interval 0003. When these plates were later scanned and digitally enhanced, a subtle pattern emerged. In the infrared spectrum, faint thermal blooms radiated outward from the chest region of Kellard's subjects. Delicate halos of energy that faded within seconds. In one image, the outline almost suggested the shape of a human torso, translucent and incomplete, drifting upward from the body. Experts in early photography dismissed them as double exposures, a common flaw in 19th century chemical plates. Others argued they were intentional manipulations, meant to imitate the spirit photography craze that swept through America in the 1860s. But Duval disagreed. "If you study the bloom," he said, "it doesn't align with any exposure technique of the time. It's not a visual illusion, it's a thermal one. Something in that room changed temperature, briefly and locally. Kellard didn't fake this. He recorded it." By 2001, the Smithsonian had archived the entire Kellard collection, including the reconstructed soul balance apparatus. The device remains an eerie artifact, rusted, skeletal, with faint traces of mercury residue still visible on its base. Visitors often describe a chill when standing before it, as though the room itself remembers its purpose. At the very end of Kellard's final notebook lies a sealed page, bound with black thread. On its surface, written in block letters, are 7 words: for the day they can weigh thought itself. Beneath that, his initials once more. HK. No record exists of his final years. Some say he withdrew from medicine altogether, others that he was quietly institutionalized under another name. But his instruments, his obsession, survived. Him, buried in silence until one archivist pulled a dusty box into the light nearly a century later. And perhaps that was his final experiment. Not to weigh the soul itself, but to see if anyone, someday, would believe it had a weight at all. In 2003, nearly 130 years after Dr. Henry Kellard's first experiments, a new team revisited his impossible question. In the Cambridge Biomedical Research Centre, physicist Dr. Henry Duval partnered with Dr. Miriam Hall, a clinical psychologist specializing in near-death cognition. Their aim was neither to prove nor to dismiss Kellard's theory, but to finally understand what, if anything, he had measured. They began with precision Kellard could only dream of: vacuum-sealed chambers, infrared balances, and electromagnetic sensors tuned to detect fluctuations at the atomic scale. Each experiment was conducted with donated medical cadavers, monitored through their final neurological shutdown under tightly controlled temperature and air conditions. The goal was simple: to remove every variable Kellard could not. In the first trial, no physical weight loss was detected. The scale held steady through the cessation of heartbeat and brain activity. But as the neural patterns flattened, a new anomaly appeared: a sharp, transient burst of electromagnetic radiation. It lasted no longer than 3 seconds, coinciding precisely with the final flicker of cortical energy. Dr. Duval described it as a silent flash, invisible yet unmistakable. Each subsequent test reproduced the same effect: a spike in electromagnetic release, followed by a subtle thermal bloom radiating outward from the chest cavity. Kellard's mercury-based system, they realized, had been sensitive to temperature and field distortions. His 19th-century instruments, crude yet conductive, had acted like a primitive amplifier. He hadn't measured the literal weight of the soul. He had captured the energy signature of neural death. Still, data alone couldn't explain the human side of Kellard's obsession. That's where Dr. Miriam Hall entered the picture. Over 15 years of research, Hall had collected interviews from hospice patients and individuals revived after clinical death. The consistency of their experiences startled even her. A shared sensation of lightness, a drifting or rising feeling that preceded unconsciousness by seconds. When she presented these findings to Duval, the room fell silent. Here was a strange echo, a subjective experience that mirrored an objective anomaly. Hall proposed an audacious idea. What if the sensation Kellard's patients described, that feeling of leaving the body, was not a metaphor, but a reflection of the very electromagnetic surge we now observe? Duval hesitated. He was a man of instruments, not intuition. But the data was stubborn. The bursts were measurable, repeatable, and consistent across all trials. In one particularly striking session, as the sensors captured the neural quieting of the final moments, the electromagnetic field didn't simply spike. It oscillated, as though pulsing outward in waves. Hall compared it to a broadcast signal fading into static. The results challenged both science and philosophy. If consciousness was purely chemical, why did the end of that chemistry release a coherent electromagnetic pulse? Something ordered? Something directed? Was it decay or departure? When the findings were published in Nature Neurology later that year, the response was polarized. Skeptics called it romantic physics, arguing the electromagnetic release was nothing more than residual charge dispersing from neural collapse. But others, biophysicists, theologians, even philosophers, saw it as a modern echo of Kellard's ghostly weight. Duval himself remained cautious. "I don't think he proved the soul exists," he told an interviewer, "but he might have been the first to prove that something happens when life leaves the body, something measurable, but not yet definable." For Hall, however, the meaning was more human. Her interviews revealed a pattern not of fear, but of calm. Patients nearing death described a quiet detachment, as though gravity itself were loosening its hold. In their final moments, many spoke of a warmth, leaving through the chest, the same region where Kellard's cameras had once recorded faint halos of energy. She began to see Kellard not as a fanatic scientist, but as a grieving husband who had turned his loss into an experiment. He had weighed death not out of curiosity, but out of love, desperate to find proof that the woman he buried still existed, somewhere, as something. Duvall once said that Hall brought the soul back into the science Kellard had left behind. Together, they published their conclusion in 2005. What Kellard recorded was not the weight of the soul, but the trace of departure, a measurable echo of transition between biological order and oblivion. It is not proof of spirit, but proof of a moment we still cannot name. Years later, when Duvall visited the Smithsonian exhibit displaying Kellard's original soul balance apparatus, he stood before it for a long while. The iron had rusted, the glass fogged, the mercury long since drained. Yet something about its shape, that perfect equilibrium between precision and faith, moved him deeply. He wasn't wrong, Duvall murmured to a reporter beside him. He was just asking the right question a century too early. As he turned to leave, the camera caught his reflection in the glass chamber, pale, suspended, weightless. For a fleeting moment, he looked almost like one of Kellard's subjects, a man caught between reason and wonder, between science and grief, between what can be measured and what refuses to be weighed. By 2010, Dr. Kellard's instruments had become relics of curiosity, displayed in the Harvard Museum of Medicine as examples of proto-biophysics, a term meant to separate his work from superstition. But fate has a way of rewarding obsession. That year, during a routine restoration of Kellard's original soul balance apparatus, a team of conservators stumbled upon a hidden compartment inside the instrument's wooden housing, a space no larger than a handkerchief box, sealed behind a brass plate. Inside was a single glass negative, wrapped in deteriorating linen and marked with a faint pencil scrawl. Trial 9, January 1876. It was Kellard's missing experiment, one never mentioned in his published notes, nor in the medical register that chronicled his trials. The discovery sent ripples through both academic and historical circles. Within days, the museum authorized its development under controlled laboratory conditions. When the plate was finally revealed, the room fell silent. Against the deep grain of the negative, the image appeared almost abstract, a seated human form blurred in shadow. But near the chest and head, veins of light seemed to branch outward, faint yet deliberate, like smoke caught mid-motion. At first, analysts assumed a chemical reaction or double exposure, but when spectral imaging was applied, the pattern sharpened. The luminous tendrils traced precisely along known cranial nerve and spinal alignments, an impossible detail for an era before X-rays or neural diagrams. Dr. Henry Duvall, now retired but still consulting, was called to examine the findings. He spent hours comparing the patterns to Kellard's original diagrams. At one point, he whispered to the curator, "He didn't capture a ghost. He captured the moment thought became silence." Subsequent spectrographic analysis yielded an even stranger result. The distribution of tonal gradients in the negative, the density of light, the concentration of exposure, corresponded almost perfectly with modern EEG brainwave frequencies in the final seconds before neural death. The correlation was so exact that neuroscientists could overlay the 1876 photograph onto a 21st century EEG readout and see nearly identical waveform dispersions. It was as though Kellard had, without knowing it, photographed the collapse of consciousness, the body's final surge of electrical coherence as life extinguishes. Historians argued over how he could have achieved such an effect. Some speculated that the mercury vapor in his sealed chamber acted as a primitive, photosensitive field, registering energy transitions invisible to the naked eye. Others dismissed it as coincidence, a trick of exposure time, temperature, and failing equipment. But a few, including Hall, saw something deeper. To her, the photograph was not evidence of superstition or error. It was a portrait of departure. When Dr. Miriam Hall was invited to view the restored plate, she arrived quietly, refusing media interviews. She stood before it in a darkened archive room, the image projected on a backlit panel. In her later writing, she described the moment. It wasn't light. It wasn't spirit, it was recognition. As though the body itself was saying goodbye, not in words, but in frequency. Hall proposed a radical reinterpretation of Kellard's legacy. He had not proven the soul's weight, nor had he disproved it. What he had done, unknowingly, was to measure the body's farewell to consciousness, a transitory burst of order before entropy reclaims the system. The rediscovery reignited debates across disciplines. Physicists saw it as early evidence of energy conservation at death, the final diffusion of neural electricity. Theologians called it a measurable amen. Philosophers debated whether a pattern could constitute proof of presence, and yet, amid all the speculation, Kellard's intention remained hauntingly clear. Every entry in his surviving journals returned to one aching idea, that something leaves and that it should be possible to catch its trace. That idea, born of grief, pursued through science, now seemed to have found its proof, not in faith or numbers, but in the quiet persistence of a photograph. In the years following the discovery, the image of Trial 9 became one of the most studied artifacts in the intersection of medicine and metaphysics. Even with advanced scanners, no one could fully explain how the negative captured what it did. Some researchers noted that the light patterns appeared to ripple slightly when digitized, a microscopic shimmer caused by uneven emulsion decay. But others swore it looked alive, pulsing faintly as though it still remembered the heartbeat it had once recorded. In a closing interview for the Boston Journal of Medical History, Dr. Hall summarized what Kellard's century-old experiment had ultimately revealed. He wanted to weigh the soul. Instead, he weighed the moment it left. Her words echoed Kellard's own final note, scrawled in the margin of his last logbook, preserved beside the apparatus. If it departs, it must move. If it moves, it can be measured. And so, after more than 100 years, his impossible question found its answer, not in proof, but in persistence. He had measured not faith, not fantasy, but transition itself, that delicate instant between the living and the gone, the body's last luminous signal to the world it was leaving behind. In the end, Kellard didn't weigh the soul. He captured its echo, the soft, invisible weight of everything that cannot stay. When the story of Dr. Jonathan Kellard resurfaced in 2010, it spread like wildfire across both academic journals and late-night television. Newspapers called him the 21-gram doctor. Within weeks, his name appeared in op-eds debating everything, from the limits of medical ethics to the meaning of death itself. Skeptics were quick to respond. Physicists dismissed the rediscovered negative as nothing more than a 19th-century chemical mirage, citing impurities in early glass emulsions. Medical historians argued that Kellard's notes reflected the wishful errors of grief, not the rigor of science. Yet others, neurologists, philosophers, even theologians, saw something deeper in the blurred lines of his legacy. They called it the birth of consciousness science, the first recorded attempt to quantify the invisible boundary between being and not being. As controversy grew, museums across the United States began curating exhibitions under titles like The Weight of the Soul and Matter of Departure. Art students recreated Kellard's sealed iron chamber in installations filled with fog and candlelight. Visitors would lie beneath a replica scale, feeling the subtle hum of mercury beneath the glass, imagining what it meant to be measured as you disappeared. Religious leaders divided sharply. Some condemned the experiments as sacrilege, a human trying to invade the domain of the divine. Others praised them as proof that faith and inquiry were never enemies, merely partners chasing the same unanswered question. To them, Kellard was not a blasphemer, but a man who sought evidence that love, soul, or consciousness did not vanish, only changed state. But as historians continued to comb through his recovered papers, a quieter and far more personal revelation surfaced. Among the asylum archives where Ellen Crane had found his journals decades earlier, a single document had gone unnoticed, a cholera death certificate from 1873. The name on it, Mary Kellard, age 34, listed cause of death, respiratory failure following infection. And in the margin, written in Jonathan Kellard's own hand, a small numerical note, 21G. The implication was staggering. Before he tested patients, before he published anything, Kellard had conducted his very first measurement on his wife. The woman whose loss had shattered him, the one he could not accept as gone. What the world had long regarded as an act of discovery was, in truth, an act of mourning. He had not set out to weigh the human soul in the name of science. He had been trying to weigh love itself. Every equation, every adjustment to his fragile scale. Every night he spent watching for a flicker of motion in the candlelight was a confession of longing. He pleaded to find proof that the bond between two people could not simply end in air. When his name re-entered the scientific canon, it did so with a strange duality. Kellard was now remembered not just as a doctor, but as something else entirely. A man who refused to believe that death could erase connection. And perhaps that was his truest experiment of all. To prove that grief itself has weight, and that when we measure what's lost, we are really measuring the part of ourselves that follows it. The voice returns soft, almost like memory itself speaking. Maybe the soul never weighed 21 grams. Maybe that number was never about the body at all, but about what we lose when we can't let go. Kellard's scales were precise, his instruments exact, yet what he sought could never fit inside a measurement. What he chased wasn't a substance, but a silence, the instant between the final heartbeat and the breath that does not return. We build machines to measure everything, light, distance, decay, even time. But there remains a space between the measurable and the meaningful, a weight we feel only when something leaves us. Perhaps that is what he recorded. Not the soul escaping, but the absence it leaves behind. The candlelight he watched flicker was never proof of the afterlife. It was the reflection of his own grief, bending against the glass. And yet, more than a century later, we still look at his notes and wonder. Not because we believe in ghosts, but because we want to believe that love leaves evidence. He wanted to prove the soul weighed something. Perhaps what he proved was that it does.